Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. After dinner, my dad spent the rest of the evening in front of the TV. If it wasn't baseball, it was football. If it wasn't football, it was soccer. If it wasn't soccer, it was hockey. It didn't seem to matter what the sport was. My dad enjoyed it. He favored baseball. But if it wasn't baseball season, he watched the rest with little to no reservation. Me, not so much. Even before the change, and my new brain made homework so much easier, I'd still rather do homework than sit and watch sports. Tonight, I made an attempt to tolerate it for about 30 minutes before I couldn't anymore. I used the excuse of homework so I could get away. Even the thought of lying to my dad over such a little thing as working on homework made me feel terrible guilt. So I did do some homework after I got up to my room. I had to lie about so much already that honesty in the other areas mattered so much more to me now. My homework didn't take long, so I booted up the computer to check my email. My mom was sure to have replied to my last message by now, and she wouldn't wait too long before getting antsy and calling to check on me. I figured it would be at least a month before she got distracted by something else and limited her emails to once a week. It didn't usually take so long, but she was still really sensitive about my disappearance. I forgave her a lot of fussing for that worry. I was right. There was an email waiting from my mom. She asked about school, if I had any new friends, and all about how I was getting along with my dad. I was in the middle of answering her when I heard movement in the tree out back where Edward had been waiting, and was not at all surprised when I heard the tree right outside adjust to the weight of someone climbing on it. Then my window slid open and he climbed inside. I gestured politely for him to sit on the rocking chair in the corner and then took a moment to finish the message to my mother. I shut down the computer after the email had been sent and turned to look at my visitor. Got tired of perching in the trees? I had to ask. I'd heard him fidgeting. Well, your father is completely occupied. I figured it wouldn't be that big of a deal to start our talk a little earlier. He walked leisurely over to the old rocking chair and settled into it with a smile in my direction. I shrugged. And while I didn't need to sit down or even to move, I got up and walked over to settle down in my favorite spot on my bed. Comfort was now more of a frame of mind than a condition of the body, and I liked to lean against the wall and stretch my legs out on my bed. My books were piled comfortably next to me. There was still a stack of them there from the night before, and I noticed him look at them curiously before his eyes returned to me. He waited until I got settled and then leaned back in the rocking chair. He was still watching me with those distracting topaz eyes. I tried to appear unaffected and instead looked back at him expectantly. He didn't make me wait long. First, the rules, he started. I smiled at that. I was completely and utterly amused that there were rules to being a vampire, but I figured since the entire world was quite unaware we existed there had to be a reason why. Really, the only rule is keeping the secret, Edward revealed after a moment, almost seeming disappointed. Everything else stems from that one factor. That's easy enough, and I had kind of already figured that one out. I wasn't going to let him off easy. There had to be a reason for them to insist he shadow me, and this was really weak. He grinned, his manner loosening up slightly. I guess he was getting used to the idea that while I was likely a ticking time bomb, I didn't have a short fuse. True, that's another thing that's really so extraordinary about you. You seem to have been able to keep that rule instinctively. He gestured absently to the pile of books beside me. And you can concentrate well enough to read and study. Not without effort, but it was worth it to me to do so, I admitted. They all seemed to think I was really something unusual, but I couldn't agree. I was dangerous, and it scared me. As for the reading, my mom kept a real close eye on me for the first month or so. She'd check on me randomly in the middle of the night. I'd run out to hunt, and then had to come right back. I needed distractions. Books helped provide that. I could hear Charlie moving around downstairs again, but he was only heading into the kitchen during the commercial to get another beer and get rid of the empty bottle from his last one. We both listened to him for a moment before we started talking again. All right, some background and history then. Typically, vampires are a law unto themselves. Nearly all are nomads. They cannot stay long in one place because of their diet. They don't like being told what to do, and they don't recognize a higher authority. The exception to this are the Volturi. He spoke a little more softly while we waited for Charlie to become absorbed in his game again. The Volturi? That sounded like something entirely vampire, and like something I needed to know about. The Volturi are a coven of 3 vampires and 2 of their mates, who live in Italy. They're the closest thing we have to a ruling class, and they police the vampire world, making sure that everyone keeps to the rule of secrecy. Edward had expected my need for more information, and he explained before I had a chance to ask. They are the only higher authority that vampires recognize. If you'd gone wild in Arizona and turned the city into your own personal killing field, the Volturi would eventually have hunted you and brought you to justice. Afterward, they'd have gone after your maker for not ensuring that you kept to the rules. Edward didn't temper this information much, though I could see he wanted to. I winced. I wasn't misled by the innocuous-sounding idea of justice. They'd have killed me, though the idea of them going after the one who'd made me like this sounded quite attractive. Some part of me was delighted at even the hypothetical thought of being the direct cause of his death. 3 vampires keep the peace over the entire world. You imagine they aren't home much. I tried to smooth over my sudden vindictiveness with something far more innocent. They are millennia old and they don't leave Volterra often. They send out their guard. They recruit vampires they see as of worth to them and give them a place in their personal guard, Edward continued. That made more sense to me. They had an army of vampires that was dangerous enough to keep the rest of the vampire world running scared. This was not a group of people I wanted to be aware of. My existence. Carlisle spent some time with them. Some centuries back, he made friends with the 3 leaders, and they asked him to become a part of their guard. I think they saw him as a curiosity, more than anything else. Edward started to rock slightly in the chair, though it made no sound at his movement. This last admission surprised me. It wasn't what he told me, but why he told me. He thought I would want to know. I had no idea how I knew that he was trying to share parts of their lives with me. But there was no doubt in my mind. I smiled at him in thanks. He was right. I did want to know these more personal things. They made the Cullens seem more like people instead of the merciless killers I thought all vampires would be. His breath caught as I smiled at him and I looked down, pulling one of my books into my hands. I wasn't sure what had caused that reaction, so it made me nervous. I looked at the book I'd grabbed and smiled a little. It had been in my mind a lot lately, so I wasn't terribly surprised. Sonnets from the Portuguese. I ran my hands over the little hardback cover. So why did he leave? I wondered aloud as my finger traced the embossed words on the front of the book. He cannot condone their way of life. They are not vegetarians as we are, refusing to feed on human blood. It was too hard for him to suffer witness to the destruction of human life, Edward easily explained. There really aren't very many of us that refuse to feed on humans. I know only of 2 families, ourselves and a coven in Denali that we see as cousins. From what I'd noticed of Carlisle, that seemed so appropriate. To me, he was the embodiment of compassion and mercy, a leader so extraordinary that others wanted to follow him into a hard life of restraint and benevolence. How does he do it? I wondered aloud, my eyes lured to Edward's face again. I remembered Esme earlier, when she was explaining Carlisle's absence, that he was a doctor. How does he work at the hospital like he does? I'd known he was a doctor. It was part of the gossip Jessica had imparted to me in the school cafeteria. It was all the more remarkable now that I knew he was a vampire. It took a level of control that was almost incomprehensible to me. Practice. After all this time, I don't think he even notices the thirst anymore. It took him a long time, centuries actually. Just like you, the goal was more important to him than the pain that it caused him. Edward was looking at me, watching me, while he spoke. Again, his expression revealed nothing personal of what he was thinking or feeling. I acknowledged that I understood what he meant. For me, it was more important that I didn't hurt my family, more important than satisfying my thirst for their blood. It didn't need to be said, but I did it anyway to cover that I didn't know how to react to the way he was watching me. Charlie started moving around downstairs again, and my room grew silent as we both listened to him. He turned off the TV and after a moment started up the stairs. He'll check in on me before he goes to bed. I looked up toward Edward, but he was already sliding into the closet before the words left my lips. By the time Charlie opened the door, my book was open like I'd been reading. I smiled at Charlie in greeting, swallowing against the increase of venom in my mouth and ignoring the burn in my throat. The closer to late night, when I could hunt again, the worse it got. Gonna be shutting down soon, Bells. It's getting pretty late, Charlie observed, as he nodded at my book. Yeah, I'll get to bed soon, Dad. Another lie, but I was sure he wouldn't have understood if I informed him that not only didn't I need to sleep anymore, but that I physically couldn't. Okay, night, then. Have a good day at school tomorrow. Without any more fuss, he closed my door and wandered off to bed. After Charlie left, I looked back over at the closet, and Edward was sliding back out silently. I had to hold back a giggle at how it would have seemed to anyone else. I'd never had a male other than my father or Phil in my room before, and it seemed kind of strange to have one hiding in my closet, even though the circumstances were completely innocent. "He loves you very much," Edward observed, as he sank back into the rocking chair with inhuman grace. His voice was even softer now, though I had no trouble hearing him. "I know all of this has been really hard on him. He was delighted when I told him I wanted to move here. I loved my father. The way he was so accepting, taking me unquestioningly into his house and his life, it made me appreciate him so much more than I ever had. Never once in my life did I question the knowledge that my father was a good man. Everyone has their faults, their weaknesses, but underneath all of that, some people were just downright good. My father was one of those people. I've been very lucky in my parents. Even Phil, he's a good guy." A slight smile tipped at the corners of my mouth. It was getting easier to relax around Edward since he'd stopped being scary and intimidating. I hoped that this easy way would continue. "Phil, he's your mother's husband?" Edward questioned. I shouldn't have been surprised that he wanted to know more about me. I had told his family about my change, but the things that made up my human life, who I was, they knew nothing about. This information he would normally just pull from the minds of other people. It reminded me again, he could not do this with me. "Yeah, she got married about a year ago. They're still newlyweds." I didn't mind sharing this personal information with him. It didn't reveal anything about me that I wouldn't have shared with anyone else, really. They're adorable about it too. He's a minor league baseball player, and she had such a hard time when he went traveling. She wanted to go with him, but felt it was more important to stay with me. Now she can go with him. This was a side effect of my move that made me very happy. My mother loved being with Phil, and now my presence wouldn't hold her back from being able to be with her new husband, wherever his team sends him. A second later, I heard snoring, and I giggled softly. Charlie had finally fallen asleep. I jumped to my feet, dropping my current favorite book on top of the others as I moved to the window. Thank heaven. I thought he'd never go to sleep. I climbed over the window frame with a grace I was still getting used to. Edward got up from the rocking chair to follow me out, closing the window behind him. "Getting difficult, is it?" Edward asked curiously as he turned back to look at me, and I shrugged. "It's certainly easier after I've hunted," I admitted wryly, and looked around to see if anyone was watching, before I jumped off the roof of the house. It would not be good to have anyone witness me exhibit such unusual behavior and not even get injured. Edward was right behind me as I walked over to where the trees were close together and then took off at a run into the forest. He was fast, keeping up with me easily, though I wasn't in any special hurry, other than the fact that I always burned with thirst. I sped up, not that I wanted to race him, beat him, or get away from him. I was just reveling in the parts of this life that I enjoyed. I loved to feel the wind in my hair as I was able to consume miles with an inhuman stride. I loved the fact that I no longer stumbled, tripped, or fell on my face. As we moved farther and farther into the wilderness, I laughed in delight, leaping over drops in the terrain and skirting around trees as I headed into the Olympic Mountains and turned roughly east towards Seattle. It would take us some time of running this fast to reach the city, but I wasn't going to go so far. I just wanted to be away from populated areas. When in Phoenix, I'd done the same thing, heading out into the desert before I started hunting. I'd noticed when I killed that first den of coyotes that it was impossible for me to control what I hunted after I allowed night to let go. I didn't want to take any chances with anyone's life. Edward had no trouble keeping up with me at all, matching his stride to mine easily. He was openly amused by my delight in the run. "I take it this part of the new life hasn't been painful for you at all," he commented as we ran. This is the best part. I was a complete klutz. I tripped over things that were there, but also things that were not. No coordination at all. I didn't like to admit this, but it was surely something he would figure out before long if he hadn't already. I tried to duplicate my human self as much as possible when out among humans, and the clumsiness was a big part of that. I held up my hands, turning them at the wrist and gesturing to where there had been little lines of scars on the palms of my hands. My scars were gone now, lost in the burning of the change. "I fell a lot," I muttered, explaining the look I gave my hands and the scars that he could not see. I couldn't hold in my smile. This was something I didn't worry about anymore. being so clumsy I was almost disabled. I try to keep up the illusion that I'm still a klutz. I'm glad my parents aren't suspicious about the fact that I haven't broken any bones lately. Edward laughed at what must seem so silly. Not knowing how serious I was, I sighed silently to myself at the sound of his laugh. I could easily get used to that sound. I wasn't in the habit of lying to myself, so I had to admit that Edward Cullen being around just felt more and more right to me. It really wasn't long before we were far enough into the wilderness that I felt comfortable letting go of my carefully maintained control, and I stopped quite suddenly near a quietly moving stream. Edward came to a stop nearby, though he didn't interfere. He was back to acting cautious as my stance became more predatory. I'd scented something that caught my interest, and I knew he wouldn't interfere so long as what I hunted wasn't human. I took off again, intercepting a large moose as it came to drink at the stream. Within a moment, I had taken the large animal to the ground, holding it into place while I bit into its neck, tilting the body so the blood flowed freely into my mouth. Nothing else occupied my mind or my attention while I fed. When the moose had been drained completely and lay dead, I lifted my head, almost surprised to see Edward standing beside a nearby tree watching me. I lifted my hand up to make sure that I didn't have blood all over my face, and was a bit embarrassed to find that I had fed messily enough that there was some streaked across my cheek. Again, one of those moments I would have blushed bright red if I could. Then again, if I could blush still, I'd hardly have been in this particular situation. At least it wasn't as bad as in Phoenix. I'd always come back covered in so much blood I'd have to get rid of my clothes. After only a time or two of this, I had gone to the thrift store and purchased myself a cheap hunting outfit to preserve my savings as much as possible. I guess I'm a sloppy eater. I reached up again to rub at my face, letting my hair fall into my face to hide it as I did so. A moment later, I felt his fingers on my chin. He lifted my face to brush off a spot I'd missed, and I looked up at him in surprise. At his touch, I felt that same tingle move through me as it did before, and I blinked up into his face in stunned astonishment. I couldn't let people touch me anymore, even my parents if I could help it, so this contact felt amazingly good. For a moment, I thought he touched me because he wanted to, and thought his fingers might have lingered on ridge of my cheekbone. It felt like it had been forever since I had been able to allow anyone to touch me freely. I nearly moaned with loss when he withdrew his hand. Not so sloppy as all that. When Emmett goes hunting, he often ends up covered in blood from head to foot. Of course, he specifically goes after bears, and he does like to play with his food. Edward explained with a smile as his hand dropped back to his side. I looked away quickly, embarrassed again. He was only trying to make me feel better, and I was reading so much more into it. It was wrong of me to make something more out of simple courtesy. Well, should we head back then? I find that if I hunt bigger game daily, I do not have to drink so much. I spun around, a blur of movement to any but vampire eyes, and turned westward, leaping into the trees. I admit part of me was running from my own feelings. I didn't want to think about how very silly and young I really felt around him. He kept pace with me again as we ran, but I was quiet this time. There were still things I needed to know about, and things I wanted to know about, but I was too embarrassed at the moment to bring up any of it. Villa, Edward said when we were nearly back to Charlie's house. His tone was hesitant, curious, and it made me turn my head to look at him in question. Is anything wrong? He never said anything I expected. I didn't answer at first, and I didn't slow down, headed for the uncertain sanctuary that was Charlie's house. No, nothing's wrong, I lied, making sure that I was looking straight ahead as I did so. He made me truly wish to be a better liar for the first time in my life. Bella, Edward's tone was admonishing as he slowed. His hand touched my arm, and his fingers wrapped around my skin as he gently tugged on me until we both came to a stop. You know, I've been watching you all day, and while I can't read your mind, I think I'm getting better at reading you. You really are a terrible liar. He smiled at me to gentle his words and to encourage me to answer. Again, I felt that peculiar sensation down my spine whenever he touched me. It made me want things that I had no business wanting, things like holding his hand as we ran together, touching his lips when he gave me that crooked smile, pressing my lips to his. I just don't like being away from Charlie for long. What if he wakes and notices that I'm gone? He'll start freaking out again. I tried to explain. It too was a lie, though not as much of one. I did worry about those things. He sighed and then reached for my hand, wrapping his fingers around mine. I knew from the way my mother had reacted that my skin was cold to humans, but to me he felt warm, as I would feel to him. He drew my hand up as his fingers threaded through mine and brought my fingers up to his lips. I could only stare at him as his lips brushed the back of my knuckles. Bella, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think that something else is going on, Edward said, his lips still caressing the back of my fingers. The touch of his mouth moving against my skin made me shiver, a visceral reaction that I could not hide. That touch took me a step away from rational Bella and one step closer to the instinctual animal I became when I was hunting. I could only stare at him, unable to answer. His lips brushed the back of my fingers again, and he watched me, his expression rapt as he observed the reactions I could not hide. I think you're experiencing the same thing that I am, he continued, his voice soft as velvet. It drew me in and dazzled me. My thinking mind was no longer in control, and I was totally absorbed by him and his touch on my hand, unable to look away from his eyes. He was silent for a moment. His fingers repositioned to clasp my hand, and at the loss of his lips directly on my skin, I was able to think again. The same thing? I questioned, not sure what he meant. Yes, Edward nodded, reaching up with his free hand to caress the back of my fingers where his lips had touched. You fascinate me, he admitted, and I thought perhaps it was a grudging admission. That startled me out of the daze he'd created, and I stared at him in shock. Me? I squeaked out, surprised to the depth of my being. There's nothing about me that is fascinating, I insisted as my eyes absorbed the look of him. Compared to him, I was the complete opposite of anything interesting. I was downright dull, even as a vampire, plain brown hair, scary red eyes, dangerous and unpredictable. You, he confirmed, not letting go of my hand as I tugged on it. I find you quite beguiling. Besides everything else about you that draws me, there is this. His lips touched the back of my fingers again, and again, I shivered. This electricity I feel when we touch. I couldn't think when he was touching me. This conversation required my full concentration if I wasn't going to spout out something that would embarrass me until the end of time. After a second tug, he released my hand, though reluctantly, and it fell back to my side. There isn't anything beguiling, interesting, or even totally unusual about me. Even as a vampire, I'm dreadfully boring. I go to school, I come home and take care of my dad. I do my homework, and then I putter around my room reading until it's time to go back to school again, I insisted. I was sure the more he knew me, the less interesting I would become, especially over time. I ignored that he felt the same tingle I did. I couldn't handle that right now. It was too much. He looked back at me in surprise and then started to chuckle softly to himself. Quite the opposite, Edward insisted. Just his voice alone was enough to dazzle me, and I had to struggle not to succumb to its effect on me. I find you endlessly appealing. You are so strong, Bella. It's not just that you are succeeding at something none of us thought was even possible, but you really don't see how utterly unique you are in so many other ways. I'm just me, I insisted, trying to combat the confusion that his words created. No, Bella, I am discovering that you are not just anything. He looked like he wanted to reach for my hand again, and I took a step back from him. He was being direct, perhaps honest, but I had no idea how to respond to it. He was right. He did affect me. Still, it was just this afternoon that he all but dragged me out of biology to an awkward confrontation in the parking lot, and then an even more awkward and uncomfortable meeting with his family, where I had to disclose some of my deepest and most uncomfortable secrets. It seemed terribly fast for his opinion of me to change. Could you really go from hate to affection in the space of a single day? Immediately, he backed off, letting me have my space. He was no longer pressing me to accept what he was trying to say. Instead, he gave me another one of his crooked smiles, this one apologetic. Let's get you home, he finally said, as he took several steps toward our destination. I'll leave you there while I run home. I need to change before school tomorrow. I took several steps in the same direction and then started running again. You're going to leave me alone? I was surprised enough to question him. You haven't shown any of the usual markers for loss of control even when you were hunting. I think you'll be just fine until school starts. We'll meet you in the parking lot before first period, he assured me, his tone now confident that I'd be all right without him. I wasn't so sure, but not for the same reasons he'd given. All right, I agreed, though I am sure my tone revealed my shock and surprise. Besides, Alice called when you were with your dad. She told me that I was fussing too much. She's absolutely confident in you, you know. His tone was amused. I still think I'll keep you company. That downright shocked me. And I came to a surprise stop on Charlie's back lawn. We were back, and I was staring at him in surprise again. I thought that was the whole reason you were babysitting me. Alice wasn't sure I wouldn't lose it. I was stunned. If Alice was sure of me, why did I need a constant companion? Not that I objected to Edward, honestly, but Alice was the one who suggested that Edward shadow me. He shrugged, shaking his head slightly. Bella Alice sees the future based upon the decisions that people make. A sudden change of mind changes that future. It doesn't hurt to be sure. You don't want to slip up on Charlie or on someone at school. It's better to be safe. That mollified me slightly. I didn't want to think that Charlie was in such desperate danger from me. I knew I was a monster now, and he was right that it didn't hurt to be safe. I nodded in understanding and then walked over to the tree that sat just outside my bedroom window. I could jump directly onto the roof, but in case I was overseen, scaling a tree was much less suspicious. He stopped me with a hand on my arm before I could grab onto the tree, and I glanced at him in question. He offered me a cell phone, a small silver rectangle that reminded me of his car, sleek and modern. It was sitting on the palm of his hand. In case you need one of us, I thought it might help you feel more confident if you could reach us at a moment's notice, he explained. It seemed strange to me that they kept around activated phones with unique numbers. My look must have communicated something to Edward because he shrugged. Alice, as if this should explain everything. Perhaps it did. I wanted to refuse, not because he wasn't right, he was, but it was so hard for me to accept this. A phone was an expensive thing, and having his family at my beck and call was so intrusive. They can't really want to be available to me all the time, especially Rosier. I think she hated me. He seemed to realize my hesitation and then reached for my hand again, lifting it up so that he could drop the phone into my palm. Well, I really think you'll be fine, but it doesn't hurt to have a lifeline, and honestly, Alice needs a way to get in contact with you quickly. Edward's tone was reassuring, and the smooth tone of it dazzled me again. We all have to be ready for her to call when she has a vision. He knew just what to say to make me accept the idea, even if I was uncomfortable with it. If it was for me, it was too much. If it was for Alice and the safety of my family and theirs, it wasn't too much to ask. I would take the phone and be available if they needed me. I just nodded and curled my fingers around it, and then pulled my hand from his and edged the phone into my pocket. I'll see you at school. Don't hesitate to call if you need me before then. My phone is number 1 on the speed dial. He took several steps back as I scaled the tree and slid open my window. Bella, he said softly from the ground. I heard him easily and turned back to see what he wanted before I climbed into my window. Everything will be all right, he said after the briefest hesitation, and I nodded to him before I climbed into my room. As I turned to close the window, my eyes were irresistibly drawn to where he had been standing on the grass below. He was already gone. I'd taken the time after Edward's departure to take care of some of the human things that I still needed to do on a regular basis. Shower, brush my teeth, and wash my face. Afterward, I'd curl up on my bed with a book. Charlie liked to check in on me in the mornings before he left, so I always cleaned up and put on pajamas when I got home from hunting. I liked the human habit of showering even though I didn't produce any body odors or oils, plus sometimes my feeding was messier than other times and I needed to wash off the blood. Charlie always amazed me at times like this. How did he not notice that I was faking sleep? I was a terrible actor. My eyes were closed and my body was still, but I didn't feel as though I looked like I was really sleeping. I figured it was something like Renee checking on me constantly before I moved here. I think she expected me to be gone every time she looked. It would probably stop after a few months. They were both still experiencing such stress from my disappearance. It made me feel guilty. It wasn't my fault, but I'd let them think it was, and they were worried I'd do it again. As it started to get close to the time I'd need to head off for school, I gathered up my homework. I'd left it on my desk the night before. Charlie liked to see evidence of my being a studious and responsible teenager. I had my head in my closet to figure out what to wear today, when I heard someone moving around in the yard and then scaled a tree to knock at my window and turned my head to see who it was. I was surprised to see Alice and walked over to open the window for her politely. She climbed in with one of her effervescent smiles and handed me a fairly large gift box. It was wrapped in brightly colored paper and topped with a bow so complicated it made my eyes cross. I saw that you didn't have anything decent to wear to school today, Bella, she explained as she handed me the box. Really? Your wardrobe is frighteningly bare. I took the box, setting it on the bed as I opened it and glanced inside. I shot her a surprised look, not really sure why she was bringing me clothes. I have clothes, Alice. I didn't have room in my suitcase for a lot, but I do have jeans and t-shirts. I started in confusion. That's all you have, Bella. I understand that there are times when it is the most appropriate attire, but it's not all the time, she grinned at me, mischievously, and then hopped back up into the window frame. I wanted to bring you a skirt, but I saw that you weren't going to wear one yet. She trailed off, eyes unfocusing for a moment. Then she turned and smiled at me again. So stubborn. Alice, I said, stopping her as she leaned forward to slide into the tree. She turned back to answer me, a reluctant look on her face, and climbed back inside after a moment's pause. Go ahead and ask me, Bella. I was hoping you wouldn't, but you've got your mind made up. You knew about me months ago. Why? I asked her, sitting down on my bed beside the box she had brought. Why didn't I tell anyone what I saw? She confirmed as she walked over to sit next to me on the other side. Bella, sometimes things have to happen in a certain way for them to work out in the best way. There are times when foreknowledge isn't always a good thing. But also, my visions don't always work the way it might seem to you. There are times I can think about what I want to see, and I am able to get glimpses or even whole spans of time that I am seeking to know about. But there are also times when things just hit me. I am not always sure why I see them or how they affect us. At least, at first, I don't know why. She looked up at me with a smile, reaching over to pat my hand where it sat on my leg. I had no idea what my initial visions of you would bring, but I had a feeling that certain members of my family would rush down there and try to prevent your change. I wasn't sure why, but I felt that would be a bad idea. I really tried to understand as I realized what she said. Alice had known about my attack in enough time to prevent it. I didn't have to be this way. For several long seconds, anger rose in me, filling my vision with a haze of crimson. I took several deep breaths, for once, letting the burn of my thirst overtake my emotions. I felt the pain in my throat for far longer than I was usually comfortable, before pushing it back down again, and I turned to look at Alice. Do you know why now? I asked once I could speak rationally again. Her eyes were full of understanding and sympathy as she looked back at me and she took my hand in hers. I do, Bella. It's not something I can tell you, though. I know it's hard, but please, trust me. Her eyes pleaded with me to understand what she was trying to say to me. So, what you're saying is, if you tell me, it will disrupt whatever future you're trying to arrange, I asked, wanting her to confirm where my thoughts led me. She nodded, brushing her fingers along the back of my hand, soothingly. How can we be sure your visions are right, Alice? That the course you see now is really the most advantageous one. I let my eyes focus in on her face again. And how do I know that the visions that are best for your family are also the best for me? Oh, Bella, she said, pulling me into a one-armed, sideways hug. They're the same thing. Don't worry so much about it. I promise, don't fight so hard and everything will eventually be just fine. I took in a deep, bracing breath and leaned into her embrace slightly. It felt good, this contact, and wasn't nearly as disturbing and distracting as when Edward touched me. Alice's hug was comforting. It helped me subdue the beast in my head just a little longer. Alice, I hope you're right. I'm not sure how much more I can take. It's too much all at once. She smiled at me as she kissed me on the cheek, and then rose from the bed and walked over to the window. I'm always right, Bella. Her smile grew mischievous as she climbed out of the window backward. But I promise, it will get easier. You're not on your own any longer. These things are easier to handle when you share it with family. You'll get used to relying on us a bit more. Just wait. With that last departing shot, she jumped out the window and was gone. I wasn't sure what to think about what she'd told me, but it was obvious she hoped that I would leave it alone. She still hadn't revealed anything to me, but I had new insight into her reasoning. It would have to do for now. I only waited a moment before I got up and walked over to close the window. I pulled the curtains, since I was going to be getting changed. Once they were closed, I walked back over to the bed and peered into the box. Black jeans, low rise, with slightly flared ankles. These were not bell-bottoms, and a snug royal blue sweater with a V-neck and long sleeves. The last thing in the box was a pair of low-heeled espadrilles in a neutral black. As much as Alice was being bossy about my attire, she did take into account that I stumbled around a lot at school, and that I wasn't going to go to the trouble of coordinating my shoes with every outfit. Black meant that I might wear them again. Even though I wasn't sure yet if I trusted her, I appreciated her consideration. And I quickly got dressed. I took a moment after I was ready to walk around my room in the new shoes with a smile. I'd never dared wear anything with a heel this high while I was human. It was a hazard to life and limb. I had to admit the outfit made me feel almost pretty. I stopped in the bathroom on my way down the stairs and peered into the mirror. Normally, I'd have pulled my hair back into a ponytail, but as I looked at myself in the mirror, I had to admit that it wouldn't look as good with what I was wearing. I brushed quickly through my hair and slid a clip into one side in a way that left most of it down, and then I made my way out of the house. Within a few moments, I was wrapped in my parka and out the door to my truck. I wasn't fond of the cold weather parka. It was huge, uncomfortable, and shapeless. It made me feel like that kid from the Christmas movie that was so bundled up he could only waddle, tip me over, and I'd roll down the street like a big round snowball. Well, perhaps not that bad. Still, it would seem odd if I didn't wear something to keep the cold Washington weather off. What was supposed to be my frail human body, humans got cold. My truck took longer to get to school than it would have for me to run, but it was part of the human charade. Also, it was a gift from my father, so I enjoyed the ride to school even though it thundered down the street. Edward's Volvo was already in the parking lot by the time I arrived. The entire family was there waiting for me, different levels of interest on each face. Rosia looked like she would rather be pulling her fingernails out with a pair of pliers. I wondered if she hated just me or if everyone inspired disgust in her. Jasper looked worried. Emmett looked amused. Alice was staring off into space, a smile of pure satisfaction on her face. Edward's expression, however, was carefully neutral, and I didn't know him well enough to know what that meant. I hopped out of my truck, slinging my backpack over my shoulder, and walked over to greet them with a slight smile. "Hey Alice, thanks for the clothes," I said, as I got close enough that it wouldn't seem strange for me to be talking to them as softly as I was, not wanting to draw any more attention to myself than necessary. My comment caused Edward's eyes to return to me. His eyes darted over my jeans and shoes before moving up to my face. He couldn't see my sweater because I was bundled up in the abominable parka monster, being devoured by goose down in my attempt to look cold like the human students did. I noticed again that the Cullens didn't try as hard as I did to appear human, or they weren't any good at it. They stood out. "You're very welcome, Bella." "You look good," Alice commented, focusing on my feet for a moment longer. "You'll have to work on being less of a klutz so I can put you in prettier shoes." That surprised me, and I blinked at her several times before I could answer. "You can't dress me every day, Alice," I insisted, shaking my head at her. "Besides, if I act less klutzy, it will make Charlie suspicious." "I can't!" She seemed utterly perplexed by my statement, and Emmett laughed in a booming tone that drew the attention of everyone in the parking lot. "For one thing, clothes are expensive, Alice, and for another thing, I do have clothes of my own to wear." I adjusted the strap of my backpack across my shoulder as though it were growing heavy, a habit from when I'd been human that I made a point to continue. "Your closet is practically empty, Bella. Isn't it, Edward?" It shouldn't have surprised me that Alice had seen Edward duck into my closet to hide from my father. I shook my head at her in exasperation and some embarrassment. "I wasn't paying attention to her wardrobe when I was in the closet, Alice," Edward informed her in an undertone too soft for humans to hear, though there was the hint of a smile about his lips. "What were you doing in her closet, Edward?" Emmett leaned forward to ask, his eyes twinkling with amusement. I decided right then that Emmett was a troublemaker. "Do you make it a habit of hiding out in pretty girls' rooms?" Edward just rolled his eyes at Emmett and ignored the comment as he stepped toward me. Rosie smirked irritably and then grabbed Emmett's hand to drag him off. I wasn't surprised that she didn't think I deserved even the most icy greeting. I cast a glance toward Jasper, who was standing protectively over Alice and watching me with suspicion in his eyes. He looked like I bothered him a great deal. "Well, I think I'll just head on to class," I explained, taking a step back and turning to head toward the building that held the English classes. "Let me walk you to class, Bella," Edward said, taking another step toward me and falling into step beside me as easily as he had last night on our run. I should have expected this since this was part of the plan, but I was still surprised at the eagerness in his voice. He seemed to want to walk me to class. I just nodded at the rest of his family and then led the way across campus. We were nearly out of the parking lot before he spoke again. "I'm sorry about Alice and her obsession with clothes," he said softly, though his tone was amused. "She dresses all of us, you know. But she is right, you do look very good." I was ready for his voice to move over my skin like velvet, but it still startled me how good it felt, how much I liked to listen to him. We reached the curb, and while I admit I was distracted by him, I'd also created the habit of stumbling over things such as this. It was an innocent, unassuming curb, and I deliberately tripped over it. What I wasn't expecting was that he would reach out to catch me. Even when I was human, no one had ever reached out to steady me when I fell or tripped. I looked up in surprise when his hands wrapped around my waist, and he lifted me easily to place me on the sidewalk. Then he smiled at me, that dazzling, crooked smile that made me forget my name, and his hands slowly dropped back to his sides. "Easy there," he teased me softly, his velvet voice filled with amusement. "You might fall and hurt yourself." I started to laugh. He didn't even have to try, and he charmed me. When he tried, I felt like melting into a puddle of goo at his feet. He was trying to make me laugh. I hadn't really enjoyed anyone's company in so very long. It felt good. He smiled again, apparently enjoying my laughter. I didn't move to continue on to class immediately, so he reached out and threaded his fingers through mine, pulling me along. I knew it was getting close to the time that class was about to start, so I let him guide me to the door of my first class without comment. When we reached my classroom, he drew my hand up to his lips as he had the night before and brushed them over the back of my fingers, eyes watching me as he did so. He smiled as I shivered. Once more, I was unable to hide my reaction. When he let go of my hand, I could only stand there and stare at him. I had a feeling he knew exactly what he did to me, and he was doing it on purpose. "I'll meet you right back here after class, Bella," he offered as he took a step back, smiling at the look on my face. That unfroze me, and I cleared my throat, nodding in acceptance before I turned and entered the classroom. Leaving my parka on one of the hooks near the door, I made my way into my seat and looked up to nearly the entire population of my English class staring at me in shock. Mike Newton dropped into the seat beside me as he had the day before, and his lips were twisted into a petulant smirk that irritated me. "So, Edward Cullen, huh?" he said sourly as he looked at me. I dropped my head, appearing to concentrate on pulling a book out of my backpack. I didn't foresee that Edward walking me to class would make me the center point of all the speculation and gossip in the entire school, but it appeared this was just what had happened. Really, if I had been honest with myself, I should have expected it. He walked me to class. "That's all, Mike," I said in what I hoped was a dismissive tone. Even if the plan was to make it appear as though we were dating, it was far too soon to appear very serious. And honestly, how could any of them believe that Edward Cullen was so quickly enamored of me? I was just me. I'd never had a boyfriend, but I had witnessed high school relationships develop time after time. A day was certainly not enough time for more than a desire to know more about a person, even with horny young teenagers. At least I hoped that it wasn't. It took longer than that for me. Now it is possible that the speculation could be that Edward was just amorous and I was available. I blinked as a sudden thought occurred to me. If we were frozen as vampires in the physical and mental states we were in when we were changed, did that mean that we were left with the same hormonal drives? Was I destined to be a horny teenager forever? My reaction to Edward did not offer me any reassurance to the contrary. Mike didn't look happy that Edward was showing me attention. And I had no idea what his problem was. I had not encouraged him. Even if Alice didn't have a plan to make it appear as though Edward and I were dating, I would never have been interested in Mike Newton. He was human. I was a vampire. Besides, there was that irritatingly cocky attitude any girlfriend of his would have to deal with. I knew that a good part of my rampant desire to smack him was that newborn nature the Cullens were so worried about, so I worked even harder at suppressing the urge. If Mike knew what I was, he'd run away screaming. Honestly, I was surprised that all people didn't run away screaming as soon as they caught sight of me. But I figured that the human mind ignored many things so that it didn't have to deal with some of the more uncomfortable facts of life. Just then the teacher called the class together and began the lesson. My mind was able to process too much more that even while I listened to the teacher and took notes, I also considered how I would deal with Mike if he continued acting like this. I appreciated his friendship but was not ever going to be interested in anything more. I was aware that eventually the fake romance between Edward and me was going to end. And I really didn't want Mike getting the idea that he could then make a move on me. Mike was human, and I was not. I couldn't imagine dating a human. What if he wanted to kiss me? I didn't know if my control could handle the stress of having my razor-sharp teeth so close to soft, breakable skin. Where there was delicate skin came the blood running under it. It pumped through their veins in distracting repetition. I was too likely to kill the human whose lips had touched mine. I had discovered the night before that when I thought about things like kissing Edward, I faded far enough into a more instinctual place where I had no business ever being so close to a human. It wasn't the time for me to take on Mike and his expectations, though The bell rang and the class started to disperse. Mike hadn't made any interest in me blatantly obvious, and it would only make me feel silly if I were misinterpreting him. I had a feeling the time would come and worried about how I would react. The vampire side of me wanted to take advantage of his interest and lure him into the woods. I knew if I let that part of me take control, Mike would never leave those woods alive. Even though Edward had promised to be there outside to walk me to my next class, I was still surprised to see him there. I tried to hide my smile as I pulled my parka over my sweater, and I saw him notice the part of my outfit he'd missed earlier. His eyes moved over me with what I thought might be appreciation, but I was fairly sure I had to be reading him wrong. I flung my backpack over my shoulder and walked over to join him. "Bella," he greeted in his warm voice, and again, he surprised me by taking my hand. "Where are we headed next?" I didn't pull away as his fingers curled around mine and drew me closer to him. My breath stuttered slightly. Although I didn't need to breathe to live, my body still continued the habit, and just his touch on my hand interfered with that. "Government," I said quickly, trying to gloss over the reaction that I was having to his touch. He didn't comment, just tugged on my hand and drew me into walking beside him. He had a funny smile on his face as we turned to go. He looked over to observe Mike Newton standing outside the classroom, watching us. I thought the look on his face grew slightly smug before he turned back to me and led me into the main building and down the hallway. "You look quite good in blue," he said after a quiet moment, his eyes watching me as we walked. He was so good at saying things that would have made me blush before. Even though my face didn't flush with warm blood, I still looked down at my feet nervously and shrugged. "Alice," I explained again, even though he knew who had dressed me. "This really isn't my usual." The breaks between classes weren't very long, and at a human pace, it took us nearly all of the allotted time to get to the U.S. government classroom. "It looks very good on you," he confirmed. "Thank you?" My response was a question. I didn't know how else to respond. I wasn't used to people complimenting me, especially breathtakingly handsome young men who made even my vampire mind lose its train of thought. Edward Cullen was downright lethal to women, and I didn't mean in the deadly way a vampire was normally lethal. I couldn't read minds as he did, but I knew that nearly the entire female population of the school within sight was glaring at me, some in envy, others in hatred. He laughed at my response, drawing toward us the few remaining eyes that weren't already focused on our interaction. I was hyper-aware of being the center of attention again, and it made me very uncomfortable. I shifted my weight on my feet, another human gesture meant to distract people from the fact that I didn't need to move, but this time it was a nervous gesture. Edward was gaining far too much amusement from my reactions, not only to him but to all the people staring at me, and I glared at him pointedly. "Knock it off," I hissed between my teeth as I tried to tug my hand away. He squeezed my fingers before he let go. "I'm not really doing anything, Bella. You cannot blame this on me." I glared. He knew exactly what he was doing. My glare made him laugh again, so I turned my back on him and stomped into my class, settling into a chair in the back and draping my parka over the back of the chair. Nothing interesting happened in government that day, except that every note being passed and every whispered conversation behind the teacher's back seemed to be centered around one simple event. Edward Cullen had finally shown interest in a girl. Me. He was waiting to escort me to Trig when I left the government classroom, and I shook my head at the grin on his face. "Are you enjoying all this unnecessary attention?" I hissed at him through my teeth, too low for humans to hear, as he walked me toward Trig. "Actually, I couldn't care less about the popular reaction. It's your reaction that I'm amused by. I knew you were shy, but aren't we supposed to make this look as real as possible? Really, Bella, the whole point of this activity is so that the other students won't think it's strange for me to be around you all the time." Edward was far too amused by the whole thing. I think he was enjoying it. I could only shake my head at him as we reached the door to my class. This time, instead of brushing his lips over the back of my hand, he leaned over and pressed his lips on the line of my jaw just below my ear. I stiffened at the contact in such a vulnerable spot. To be honest, the newborn part of me, the one that I seemed so good at smothering, wanted to push him away from me and then attack. My reaction as a female was quite different. The part of me that was entirely Bella wanted to jump on him and attack him with my lips. My hand clamped down on his fingers in warning, and I held my breath, not wanting to chance what the smell of human blood would do to my control right now. Both of the urges coursing through my body had to be denied. Both would call attention to what I had become, and neither Edward nor I could allow that. Edward caught my signal, and he stopped teasing me instantly. He gave me a bit more distance, though. His head was still tilted toward mine. Bella, his voice was wary, questioning my control. I held him there, holding his body before mine since I could not hide these moments of utter stillness as I fought for control of myself. This was not a factor I expected. I had known his touch did things to me, but I didn't think he was going to push me this way. After a moment, I took in a slow breath and then gave him a small smile. I'm sorry I felt horrible that I couldn't control my reactions to him. It made me feel out of control and weak. This is not your fault, Bella, he said softly, his head still angled toward mine. In fact, this one is entirely on me. I should have known better. I shouldn't be pushing your control. Edward sounded deeply contrite, even angry at himself. My eyes rose to him. I wanted to see his face. I hoped to interpret what I thought I heard in his voice by his demeanor. I was right. He looked angry, but it seemed as though it was turned inward. How could he be angry at himself for something that I was doing? I felt my eyes narrow in irritation, and I dropped his hand to reach up and frame his face between my hands. I gave him an arch look as I tilted his head until his eyes met mine. This is not your fault, Edward. You cannot be responsible for the actions of others. Even if I lose it, it's not your failure. I wanted him to know this, to understand it, and to accept it. I'm supposed to be keeping you out of situations that test your control, Bella, he countered with a frown. I had to laugh at that. Being within miles of any human tested my control. Everything was going to test my control. There was only so much he could intercept, and really, this thing between us was so unexpected. Who could really understand what it was going to do to either of us? Edward, every time something new or unexpected happens, it will be a test. You know better than I, but I don't see this getting any easier. I just need to get more practiced. I reached up to push a hank of hair out of my face. The gesture was one of frustration, but when I caught the look on his face as he studied me, I didn't feel quite as frustrated as I had a moment before. He looked so upset that I almost smiled. If that is the case, then each time I conquer this, it will only make me stronger. Right? I countered with my own version of his crooked smile. Bella, he just shook his head at me, a smile touching his lips. Only you would find the bright side in a close call. I have to, or I'd want to cry all the time. You'd better hurry, or you'll be late to class, I reminded him, smiling. He just shook his head at me, reached for one of my hands, and again brushed his lips over the back of my knuckles. My reaction was less raw this time, not that it didn't make me shiver. It definitely did. This time, I didn't feel the nearly overwhelming urge to attack him. He left me, and I made my way into class. Jessica Stanley slid into the desk next to mine, and the anger on her features was gone almost before I saw it. She'd replaced it with the overwhelming interest of the school gossip. Here the dating charade would either take substance or become obvious that we were just faking it. Bella, Jessica started enthusiastically, glancing up at the front of the room to the teacher before she turned back to me. You have to tell me all about it. You and Edward Cullen. I've never seen him even notice a girl before. Of course he hadn't. Human girls were a walking, talking disaster waiting to happen. How would a vampire be able to justify risking a human life in such a way? I guess, I said softly, setting my books on the desk and getting a notebook and pencil from my backpack. He keeps walking me to my classes. I saw Jessica couldn't keep the envy out of her voice this time. Mike said that Edward walked you out of biology yesterday, and every time he or I have seen you since, you've been together. And now he's holding your hand. I just shrugged, not sure what to say that wouldn't sound downright contrived. Thankfully, at that point, the teacher called the class to attention and started the lesson. Again, the super brain that was now in my head made sure that I had plenty of computing space to worry about everything that was happening. I kept notes, but they didn't hold my interest. Instead, my mind reviewed the events of the last 24 hours. Edward Cullen was either an incredible actor or he was developing some sort of interest in me. I found it really difficult to believe that there was anything about me that could be genuinely appealing to a man so beautiful, experienced, and just downright enticing. It wasn't just that he was beautiful, his personality drew me as well. I found him sincerely attractive. I wanted to know more about him, and the more I learned, the more I liked. Admitting the draw that he had for me, even just to myself, made me nervous. I had a feeling that this was going to end badly for me. I was going to fall in love with the elusive and attractive Edward Cullen, and as soon as the need for this charade was over, he and his family would disappear and I would be left alone again. Was I even capable of keeping an emotional distance with him constantly around? I was far too sensitive to his presence. and I was thinking of him when he wasn't. I didn't know if I should work at keeping myself from falling for him, an effort almost surely to fail, or if I should concentrate my attention on enjoying what I could of him while he was around and deal with the inevitable pain and rejection when the time came. My own experience with men was non-existent, and this wasn't exactly something that I could discuss with my mother. She'd never be able to understand why a boy would have to pretend to show interest in me in the first place. My mother was incredibly loyal. She was often easily distracted, but this was one area she never wavered. She'd inform me that there was no way that Edward's interest wasn't genuine and I should take advantage of the attention he showed me. The loneliness that had faded almost completely since leaving the Cullen house the day before returned in full force. I wasn't alone anymore, not really, but I wasn't a part of their family, no matter what Alice implied to the contrary. I was an outsider, and would always be. I would always be separate from everyone else, watching real people's lives from the outside. As the bell rang, I made a break for it, rushing a bit faster than I should to avoid Jessica's questions. When I entered the hallway, Edward wasn't waiting for me as he promised. Instead, Alice waited for me. She smiled at me broadly, threading her arm through mine as she led me right outside. I outright ignored the other students around me, but Alice received a curious look. I was unsure about this change in the plan. Her voice, when she answered me, was too soft and fast for any humans to decipher what she was saying. They would think she was mumbling at me and see their own hearing lacking before they decided she'd done something superhuman. I told him to give you a break, she explained at the look on my face, and smiled at me in a gesture that almost seemed loving. You seemed to be overwhelmed when you were talking to Jessica, so I told him I would come and meet you. When you're ready, we can go into lunch. I gave her a grateful squeeze and it made her laugh, drawing the attention of everyone within hearing distance. Alice's laugh was addictive and adorable, filled with delight in life. You are an angel, I whispered back to her. I only yesterday found that I wasn't alone, and it is a bit much to not be given a chance to stop and absorb it all. She laughed again, leaning on my arm, and I smiled down at the top of her spiky black head, and I was instantly soothed. We might not be very close now, but Alice could very easily become my best friend. She was so easy to be around, even when she was openly manipulating all the events around her to bring about the future she wanted to see. I could see that she did these things out of love for her family instead of any personal agenda, and it made me care about her that much more. Bella, you are family now too, you know, she assured me as we got near my truck and tugged on me to slow down now that we were out of earshot of the humans. I know it's still new and doesn't feel like it, but you were meant to be a part of our family. You will be my sister, and I already love you. How did this little brat know just exactly what I needed? I looked down at her as I stopped in the middle of the parking lot, and she tilted her head up so that her eyes could meet mine, and she smiled. I felt close to tears, though I already knew I could no longer produce them. At least, I hadn't felt this as a vampire. I wanted to cry, not out of sadness, but from gratitude. She jumped up to hug me tightly and laughed her bell-like chime again. I held her close, relishing the moment of uncomplicated affection. Thank you, Alice, I whispered in her ear. I really needed to know that. Alice tugged on my arm, and we headed toward the cafeteria, now that I was no longer panicking. I found that I could even smile as we approached Edward in the lunch line. Feeling better? He asked, as we walked. I looked up at him in surprise. Alice said things were getting a bit overwhelming. She was right, but I wasn't sure I wanted to admit it to Edward. I didn't answer verbally. I shrugged. It is overwhelming, he smiled at me reassuringly. But we are here to help, not make things harder. He was saying everything right. I sighed, taking a spot in the lunch line. I took a slice of pizza. It all looked gross, but it was part of the dance of looking human. Edward grabbed a plate behind me, added more food than I took, and followed me through the line. I tried to object when he paid for both meals, but he didn't even give me the chance to say anything. His next most was to nudge me toward the table where his family waited. I settled into the empty seat next to Alice and tried to ignore the looks Jasper was giving me from her other side. As Edward slid into the chair on my other side, "Hello, Bella," she greeted, even though she'd left me at the line just a moment earlier, and Emmett laughed at her enthusiasm from where he sat across the table. "You'll never get away from her now, Bella," he warned me. "She's decided she likes you." I laughed. Emmett was just as joyful as Alice, and I found I couldn't dislike him even if he was big and dangerous looking. Emmett's entire life seemed to be about play, all different kinds of play. He was like a big kid with unlimited energy. Thanks, Emmett. I'd been trying to sneak away earlier. Yeah, no, skip school, 'cause some trouble. Now, I know better. I was very grateful to Emmett for making me smile. Even if you'd been able to outrun Alice, you would not have gotten away from me, Edward teased from beside me as he nudged around the food on his tray slightly, only repositioning it. He cut or tore portions off here and there to make it look as though he might have eaten something. I tilted my head at Edward, deciding I wasn't going to ruin this fun and light atmosphere with my insecurities. Really? I haven't tried to outrun you yet. Maybe you wouldn't be able to catch me. I smiled at him and he laughed softly. Alice giggled at the look on my face as Edward chucked. Then she patted my hand as I pulled my lunch tray closer to me. Edward is the fastest of all of us, Bella. There's a good chance you wouldn't be able to get away from him if you really wanted to run for it. Alice continued the fun as I reached for the pizza on the tray, even as a newborn. I grinned back at Alice and took a bite of the pizza. Horrible thing. It tasted worse than I imagined cardboard would taste, but more awful. Did the lunch workers dip these in grease before they served them? School lunch pizza was never edible, but I'd always enjoyed pizza delivery in Phoenix in the BV period of my life. I decided last night that the division of my life deserved better definition. Thus, I now had before vampire and after vampire, or in my own mind, BV and AV. I did my best to choke the pizza down, while I worked at keeping the expression on my face free of the disgust I was really feeling. I looked up to find Rosioli watching me, with not only her standard hostility, but also one of revulsion on her lovely features. She could make even disgust look beautiful. "How can you eat that?" she demanded. She hadn't hidden her disapproval of me from the very beginning, and apparently she wasn't going to spare me her opinions about other things either. "Part of keeping the secret," I stated as though it should be a given, shrugging at her. "I figure if I don't, then sooner or later someone is going to notice that I never really eat in public. I don't eat a lot, and most of the time I just get a drink. It's easier to choke up the liquids in the bathroom before the next class." She looked away, but I could easily translate the look on her face. She was too dignified to run into the bathroom between classes and choke anything up. This was one part of acting human that would never be worth it to her. I shrugged and went back to take another bite of my pizza, looking up to notice Edward watching me with an understanding look on his face. After a moment, he looked away and then continued tearing his roll with his elegant fingers. "Bella, how do you feel about ditching?" Edward asked me quietly as I pushed my tray away, having succeeded in people seeing me eat. "Ditching?" He'd surprised me and I wasn't sure how to answer. "They're doing blood typing in biology today," he explained, and I froze. "I think ditching biology today is the smartest thing I may ever do," I agreed, and Alice giggled next to me. "You were safe in outlying buildings all morning or I'd have told you earlier," Alice beamed at me. "Go hang out with Edward in his car," she suggested. "I've got a test in physics." I glanced over at Edward to see if that was on his agenda, and he gave me a nod. Looks like I was going to be ditching biology with Edward Cullen. There was no way that the entire class wasn't going to notice our empty table and think we weren't together, especially Mike Newton. I felt horribly guilty as I left the cafeteria with Edward. Even though I knew it would be stupid and dangerous to go to biology, I'd never deliberately skipped class when I was still human. Skipping out was something I knew I'd eventually have to learn to accept, but that didn't make it any easier. I left Edward waiting in the hall while I went into the bathroom to get rid of the couple of bites of pizza that I'd eaten. I couldn't handle the leaden weight in my stomach any longer. I checked my contacts while I was there. They were still covering enough that I would be fine until we got to Edward's car. Normally I'd refresh them now for the next class, but now I wouldn't need to do so until just before PE. It wouldn't necessarily save me an extra pair, but it would give me some comfort. I hated them. They didn't hurt, but they were really unpleasant to wear. They obscured my vision, and I was as erased of them as I would be two heavy rocks on my eyes. I glanced at Edward curiously as I met up with him again, and we made our way to the parking lot. I stared at the topaz color of his eyes with frank envy. "Is Alice right? Will my eyes turn a normal color?" I finally demanded. "I hate having to wear contacts to cover mine." He glanced at me in amusement, able to see the amount that the red was or wasn't fading every time he looked at me. "Time, Bella," he answered with a smile. "They'll fade more and more. Right now, your body is still full of your own human blood, just like she said. Until your body uses that up, I'm afraid they'll still be red." I snorted in irritation, not giving a second thought to the unladylike expression of my dismay. Edward laughed, amused by my reaction. "Actually, because of that human blood, You're probably the strongest of all of us right now. I'll bet you could beat even Emmett at arm wrestling." He smiled as we got to the car, and he considerately opened the passenger door for me. I looked up in surprise as what he said registered as I got into the car. He grinned openly at me as he leaned against the top of the door while I got situated. "Seriously," he confirmed, reading the look of doubt on my face. "You'll have to challenge him later and see. He'll never believe that you can beat him even though he knows how strong newborns are." He closed the door and walked around to the other side. He got inside and closed his own door, but he didn't start the car immediately. Neither of us felt the cold, so we didn't need the heater. He did turn on the stereo, and the inside of the car filled with soft, beautiful music. It was one of my favorites, Claire de Lune. I closed my eyes and let my head drop back against the headrest. Peace filled me. It was fleeting, but I'd come to appreciate what I could get. "I'm surprised. You don't seem like a classical girl to me," Edward observed in a voice that blended more with the music than interrupted it. "Oh, my mom liked to fill the house with classical, and this is one of my favorites," I admitted, opening my eyes to look at him. He smiled at me. In that moment, I felt the connection grow between us, an invisible cord drawing us together and joining us in a way I didn't understand. "This is one of my favorites, too," he said quietly, as though he wasn't sure he should break the silence. We shared a quiet moment of mutual contentment. I wish that it could always be like that between us. Well, perhaps not always just like this. I liked when he held my hand. I liked when his lips touched my skin. Those things weren't comforting and peaceful, like this snapshot in time. Still, it was so close to the perfect instant. My eyes closed again, and we both enjoyed the moments of silence between us until the song ended. I took in a deep breath, letting it out in a sigh before another piece started, and he turned the radio down so that the sound wasn't so invading. "Tell me what you're thinking, Bella." Edward's voice was soft. I could tell he didn't like having to ask. His tone was so reluctant, but his eyes so eager. I opened my eyes to look at him, amused again by the fact that he was so frustrated by not being able to read me. He was watching me. "I really am an open book, Edward. You may not be able to read my mind, but my mother says that my eyes hide nothing." I didn't feel like I was giving anything away. He had to have noticed that already. "That reminds me," he started. His voice softened, moving over my skin like a caress. "How can your parents not have noticed how much your eyes changed? Even with the contacts, they're not the same brown at all." "Oh, fabulous." Edward had perused my father's collection of Bella portraits that were scattered all over the main level of the house. My father didn't spread out the cute and adorable ones. No, his collection detailed all the awkward and embarrassing ones. The braces, out-of-control hair, and the extreme acne. My head fell back on the headrest, and I sighed. "I haven't had a chance to hide those pictures yet," I said in a pained voice, reaching up to rub my forehead with one hand. I didn't know vampires could get headaches, but it was a distraction from thinking about how many horrible pictures of me this gorgeous man had seen. Every girl's worst nightmare, the guy they liked going through the old family album full of reminders of years she really wanted to forget. My father's walls were that old family album. Other than the fact that they make your current differences painfully obvious, why would you want to hide them? Edward was perplexed again, and the tone in his voice made me laugh. "Those portraits are horrible, Edward, but to answer your question, both of my parents are very good at not noticing things that are too unpleasant or confusing. I was home, and I appeared safe and unharmed. If I acted a little strange and took up wearing weird-colored contacts, it was better than me taking off permanently or failing school. I've missed a lot of school since the attack, but I'm far from failing. Even when I missed days, I still kept up." Edward shook his head at my explanation, chuckling to himself softly. He had laughed a lot last night, and today, he seemed so much less dour than when I had originally met him. It was strange. "Well, your parents' obliviousness certainly makes it easier for you to pick right back up in your life," he acknowledged as he shook his head. "Charlie does have an interesting mind. His mind is not as clear to me as most people's minds are. I catch impressions of things more than actual words, whatever protects you from my mind reading. I can see where you got it." This startled me, though it shouldn't, and I turned to face him, wanting to see his expression as we talked. "Really? What was my dad thinking while you were trying to look into his head?" He was used to this mind-reading thing, but having insight into my dad's mind was a unique opportunity. I wondered if I was really reading him right. Had I hid my change from him as well as I thought I did? Well, like I said, it's not as clear as with most people. He loves you. You really are the center of his life. You and fishing, The man is obsessed with baseball and fishing. Edward was amused by the simplicity that is my dad's life. I really was the most complicated thing he dealt with other than work. I laughed at his assessment and nodded. Yeah, my dad's a smart guy. He wouldn't be the chief if he wasn't, but he's really into his simple pleasures. Am I succeeding at hiding things from him? Edward, I want him to be safe. I want to be able to stay as long as I can. I was nervous waiting for his answer, even though he'd already asked me what I thought. I wanted confirmation. He wasn't thinking about those things when I was listening to him. From what I could catch of the way he thinks, I think you're right. Edward smiled at me. He seems more interested in making sure you're safe and sound now than he does in taking in details that don't make sense and trying to understand them. It would interrupt his fishing time, I supplied with amusement. Suddenly I noticed movement by the biology classrooms, and my head turned immediately as though taking in a threat. I laughed in amusement. Mike Newton was practically dragging Lee Stevens toward the nurse's office. Neither of them looked happy. Thank you again, Alice, I said with some humor. The humans dodged the bullet yet again. Today they get to live. My tone was soft and somber as the last thought slipped out, and Edward reached across the console to claim my hand as he seemed to do so often lately. Bella, don't feel badly about all this. You're doing unbelievably well, he tried to reassure me. You don't need to stroke my ego, Edward, I admonished. I know I'm dangerous now. I could snap at any second and go after someone. I looked down at my hand clasped in his. His thumb was moving over the back of my hand in a soft caress, and I looked back up into his face. Thank you, I started, not sure exactly what I wanted to say or how to say it. It can't be easy to spend most of your time trying to keep me out of trouble, but thank you just the same. His eyes smiled at me as he reached up and touched my cheek with his free hand. Everything in me stopped to pay attention at the touch of his skin on mine, and I blinked up at him in confusion. Bella, it is no trouble for me to be your shadow, he said softly, his eyes looking into mine. I am enjoying this time with you more than you will ever know. I wasn't lying last night when I said that you are fascinating to me. I just blinked, unable to bring myself to look away from his dazzling eyes. I wasn't sure how to react to that statement. Last night, I didn't believe him. I didn't think that he could be telling the truth. Today, I was looking into his eyes while he said it, and while I knew he was a good liar, I didn't think he was lying now. I didn't want to make any assumptions, though. He could easily find me fascinating in an academic way without having any interest in me as a female. The way he touched me, however, said that his interest could not be at all academic. Edward, I couldn't just let this go. I was a coward about so many things, but I was also unbelievably stubborn about others. Define fascinating. Does that mean that you don't want to fake the whole dating thing, or is it just that you cannot read my mind like you can do everyone else? His fingers ghosted across my cheek and his eyes didn't look away from mine. I'm not sure yet, Bella. I don't think I would feel this absorbed with you if it were just that I couldn't read your mind. He seemed to have as much trouble expressing how he felt as I had. It doesn't explain the pleasure I get when I touch your skin. I stared back at him wide-eyed. I could only watch, feel, take in how he looked and felt. My thinking mind shut down again, and I focused entirely on him and how I was reacting to him. As he talked, his fingers moved across my face, tracing over my cheekbones and brushing the outside curve of my ear. The fingers of his other hand tightened around mine. Bella, I know it's terribly forward of me, and he paused as though he was unsure of my reaction and was afraid I might lose control again. I would like to kiss you, if you'll allow me. I blinked in shock, and my breath caught. Could this gorgeous, one-of-a-kind, incredible man really be interested in me in the way that I was interested in him? Could I risk him kissing me? I had the feeling that, if I allowed it, I would be lost to him completely. Was it worth the risk to my heart? Would this put irreparable holes in my control? I found myself leaning toward him before my conscious mind had even made the decision, and I forgot how to breathe as he leaned toward me. Our faces, our lips, were only a fraction of an inch apart, and we both hesitated before he leaned in just that little bit more, and his lips met mine in the softest of feather-light touches. His lips touched mine a second time, the pressure of his touch increasing. It was as though he'd let himself understand that I wasn't human. He wasn't going to hurt me if he used just a little more pressure. His mouth touched mine a third time, parting slightly as his hand slid into my hair and he pulled me closer, rubbing his lips against mine. He didn't try for anything deeper, just a touching of his lips on mine. It was enough to just enjoy the touch of one another, the taste that transferred onto our lips, and hailed his sweet, incredible breath, reveling in his scent. It called to me, drew me into him, until I nearly flew across the console, pressing myself into him. This continued for only a moment longer before he leaned back, his eyes focused on my lips still. We were both gasping for air, though we didn't need air. Our bodies were still reacting to the surge of feeling between us. I heard the bell ring dimly in the background as our eyes met, and we could only stare at each other in surprise. Whatever was going on between us was absolutely mutual. With that realized, both of us suddenly saw the need for a bit of distance while we dealt with what was happening. I was out of the car, backpack over my shoulder again, in a move that really was too fast. I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't help myself. I needed some air and some distance from Edward. He came around the car, giving me several feet as he fell into step beside me and accompanied me to the gym. Both of us were silent as we walked, needing the time to think more than empty words at the moment. He left me at the door to my class after a quiet reminder to replace my contacts, and I walked inside to get ready. It was time for a full period of pretending I was just as much of a klutz as I'd been as a human. It would take some careful effort and muscle control to do this without killing anyone. I'd have to make sure that none of my wild shots hit anyone and didn't or make holes in the concrete floor. It was basketball this week. I was not looking forward to any of this, but it was part of the game of playing human. Gym went horribly as I had expected. Luckily, no permanent damage was done, not even to the ball. I got dressed again in my street clothes as fast I could get away with, and tried to make my way out of the gym without running into anyone. I didn't succeed. Mike Newton was waiting for me. I walked just a bit faster to avoid him, but he trailed after me with a single-mindedness that was quite impressive. Edward Cullen, Bella, really? Mike sounded disgusted as he followed me toward the door. What do you mean, Mike? Could he really be that self-absorbed? He was so sure that if he wanted a girl, she wouldn't be able to resist him. He's just a pretty face. He hasn't bothered with any of the girls in this school the entire time he's been here, and now you two are a thing when you've only known him 2 days. His tone grew more and more petulant, and it grated on my nerves. It shivered down my spine like a malevolent spirit. That's not really any of your business, Mike, I informed him coldly. I wondered if he'd seen the kiss Edward and I had shared in the car, and that was why he was being so petty and relentless. I guess, if you want to go that direction, as handsome as everyone seems to think he is, he's a pretty cold fish, though. Hasn't bothered to make any friends outside his family the entire time he's been here. Mike would not let up, and I struggled with the sudden urge toward violence as I pushed my way out of the gym doors and into the open air. I felt like Mike's attack was directed not just at Edward, but at me. I understood all the reasons Edward had kept himself aloof. I understood how hard it was to make human friends. Selfless, caring, concerned, protective, ever the gentleman. Edward made sense to me. I couldn't understand Mike at the moment, and my reaction was entirely savage. I wanted to disembowel him. My mind suddenly filled with scenarios, ways I could kill him painfully. Mike kept following me. He walked too close, crowding into the space I used to keep humans away, the space I used to keep them safe. Then there was a touch on my shoulder. I turned, ready to attack, and came face to face with Edward. He looked worried. My eyes filled with his face, my lungs filled with his scent. My mind suddenly grew with the knowledge that I'd been a microsecond from breaking the silence, revealing the existence of our kind to the humans. Not just that, I had come so close to doing something really horrible to Mike Newton. I threw myself into Edward's arms, wrapping around him as though he were a lifeline. I buried my nose against his throat, doing my best to make sure that his scent crowded out anything else. His arms went around me, and he turned and glared at Mike, who hadn't yet backed away. The look on his face must have revealed just how lucky Mike was to still be alive, because he finally took several steps backward and walked off. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was waiting for the shutters to stop. I was shivering with the aftermath of what had almost happened, and with guilt over how close it had been. I was grateful to Edward for having been there right in time. I felt him nudge me, and he turned slightly, walking me toward the parking lot. He didn't ask me any questions. I was sure he'd gotten the entire exchange from Mike's mind before he'd walked away, and I really didn't want to talk about it until I was sure I had control over myself again. I heard a sound and felt the movement as he threw his keys towards someone. It smelled like Emmett. And then we were at my truck. I left it unlocked so he didn't need the keys. As he lifted me into the passenger seat and then walked around to the driver's side, I handed him the keys before I buried my face in my hands. I felt him back my truck out of the parking spot and drive out of the school parking lot. We didn't talk the entire way to his house. I thought he was giving me time to gain control of myself again. He drove as fast as my old truck would allow him to go. I only had time to blink before he was out and at my door, opening it and offering me a hand to help me out. I looked up at his big, beautiful house and heard his family moving around inside. Rosalie was complaining, muttering about how I was going to ruin everything for all of them. She was spilling vile things about how the stubborn newborn wouldn't be able to control myself and would eventually snap. I couldn't go into that house and act like everything was okay. I didn't have the strength in me at the moment to play the game. I didn't even look at Edward before I took off. I darted into the forest behind the Cullen house and headed back into the Olympic Mountains, as we had last night. I ran to get away from myself. I ran so that I didn't have to think about what I had almost done. Edward kept pace beside me again, letting me go where I wanted, just being with me, taking care of me, caring about what I felt. I stopped suddenly after about 30 minutes of random running, and I waited for Edward to make his way back to me. Since he'd overshot, he had no warning. I was going to stop suddenly. I looked up at him as he walked back to me. I knew the foremost expression on my face was one of shame. He immediately took me back into his arms, wrapping me in the warmth of his embrace. As distressed as I was, this felt natural to me. It felt like this was my place. I belonged here in Edward's arms. "Bella, it's okay," he said to me softly, his lips moving against my hair. "I almost killed Mike Newton, Edward. I wasn't going to allow him to let me off easy. How is that all right?" "If it helps, I have also wanted to kill him several times the last couple of days," he admitted to me, and his low chuckle was without humor. I looked up in surprise, my eyes searching his face. "You did? Why?" It didn't make any sense to me. Edward had done this for years. His control was something really extraordinary. What in the world would make him want to kill Mike now? All of a sudden, "You haven't heard what he's been thinking," Edward said, looking me squarely in the eye. It was pretty standard at first, horny teenager things, but today it started getting really angry. The more he saw me with you, he started plotting. What was he thinking? I had to know what would drive Edward nearly to violence. "About you," he admitted softly, looking down into my face. He was determined that you would be his girlfriend, and isn't shy in thinking about all the things he wants to do to you. Then, he started focusing on the ways he thought he could take me out of the picture. I'm afraid that little discussion is only his opening volley. That surprised me. I hadn't encouraged Mike at all. What would make him think that I'd even want to be his girlfriend? Me. But he could have Jessica, and she's really got a thing for him, I asserted, still not getting it. Edward laughed again. This time the humor was real. "You really don't see yourself clearly, do you?" Anyway, he was walking back to biology from the nurse's office when he saw me kiss you, and he freaked out. Edward kept one arm around my waist, but reached up with the other hand to brush my hair back from my face, tucking a chunk of it behind one ear. It felt like he was attacking both of us when he cornered me like that. Even though I was trying to walk away, he kept moving too close and wouldn't give me an inch of space. I admitted quietly, still filled with shame at what I had almost done. No matter what Mike had done or thought, he didn't deserve me slicing him to ribbons outside the gym. It felt like an attack. He was attacking you, Edward, and that wasn't acceptable to me. "Bella," Edward said suddenly, his fingers brushing across my cheek again. "May I show you something?" I nodded, unsure what he was up to, but any distraction at this point was a good thing by me. I was still in shock, and I was going to have to pull it together before Charlie got home tonight. He released me from his embrace and then grabbed my hand, pulling me along with him. We both started running again. This time, we headed west, toward the ocean. We ran in the direction of Forks, and then past it and back into the unclaimed wilderness beyond. He took me to an almost perfectly round meadow on the side of a slight incline. It was wide open to the sky, and in the summer it would be filled with a profusion of wildflowers. It was lovely, a truly unique place, and I released his hand to wander out into the middle, completely taken in by the feel of the meadow. I turned to look at him, and he smiled at me slowly, that crooked smile that I loved. "This is where I come when it's sunny," he said, watching me instead of the surroundings. I laughed, nodding to myself as I looked around again. This spot sat on the side of the mountain, tilted toward the sea. I imagined he would lay among the wildflowers and watch the movement of the ocean, watch the summer clouds drift by. It was easily one of the loveliest places I'd ever seen. "I can see why. I'll bet this is breathtaking in the summer," I commented as I threaded through the remains of the bright flowers. It was too cold for them now, though the wet Washington weather meant that so much was still green. He had brought me to his sanctuary. If I had any doubts before that there was something unique and special going on between us, they were gone now. This was his place, where he went to get away from it all, and he'd brought me here. I thought it would be more comfortable for you to talk here, he said as he joined me in the center of the meadow. It struck me again how considerate he was, how absolutely selfless he was being. Edward was truly someone incredible. I threw myself into his arms again and just held on to him tightly. He laughed after a moment and pulled on my arms just a little. "Easy, Bella. You're stronger than you think," he laughed, not objecting to me launching myself at him, just at how tightly I was squeezing him. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't crack any ribs, did I?" I stepped back. Concerned, my hands brushed over his chest as though I'd be able to feel cracks if I'd inflicted them. He laughed and caught my hands, holding them together on his chest, but stopping them from wandering over him. His hands curled around mine, and he pulled on them until I was standing so close that I might as well be wrapped in his arms. I didn't mind. I'd already decided it was my favorite place to be. "There are still some things that maybe you don't need to know, but are still important for you to learn." He drew me down onto the ground beside him, refusing to release my hand. "You should know about my family," he began, looking up into the sky for a moment while he ordered his thoughts. He was likely deciding which one to tell me about first. "You first," I insisted with a smile, turning my head to look at him. His head turned so that his eyes could meet mine, and I could see the surprise in his expression. "Me? What about me do you want to know, then?" His shoulders tilted, turning his body toward me so that he could focus on me while we talked. "You said that you're old enough to be my great-grandfather, but I want to know all about it. How old are you really?" Start at the beginning. Now that he seemed willing to answer all my questions, I wanted to know everything. "I was born in 1901 in Chicago." Edward was smiling as he really did start right at the beginning. "I was an only child. My father, Edward Sr., was a lawyer, and my mother, Elizabeth, stayed at home. Most women did those days, you know. My childhood was fairly usual for the time, I think. I was rather doted on, being an only child of an affluent family. I was a musician even then." Edward paused for a moment, and then tilted his head to give me a wry look. "I don't remember it very clearly, I'm afraid. Our human memories fade so quickly. The Spanish influenza hit Chicago in 1918, and my family and I were among those who succumbed." His voice grew a bit sad as he spoke, but I needed to know these things about him, even the sad things. "My father died first within hours of our arrival at the hospital. My mother and I were there together for the rest of her time. I was feverish for most of it, but through Carlisle's memories, I know what happened. She begged him to take care of me." His voice grew softer as he spoke of his mother, and I could almost feel the affection and respect that he still had for her. He had been thinking for some time that he should create a companion for himself. He'd been so long alone, and it was her words that decided him. His eyes focused on me specifically again, and I gave him an encouraging smile. "After she died, it was only a matter of time before I would have followed her, so he made his decision," he continued, eyes drifting away from me again. "He carried me away from the hospital and outside the city to his home there." He paused once more, and I knew he was remembering the bite, the pain, the unforgettable burning. "Carlisle was very patient with me, but I'm afraid I wasn't nearly as amiable and controlled as you are. We fought a great deal in our first few years. It was so hard for me to accept what I had become." His tone was so filled with emotion that I knew he mourned his humanity. "Carlisle is the one who discovered my talent, the mind reading," he continued quickly, as though avoiding the things he didn't want to think about. I had been answering him, but I was answering things that he had not yet spoken. "He does not often even think things that he will not say. That man has the most pure mind I have ever heard, and we were isolated enough that I did not realize what I had been hearing were thoughts." "That must have been unusual," I said, reaching out to touch his cheek with my hand. I had watched him while he had been speaking. His face was so expressive of his thoughts and feelings that I had to make contact with it, if even for a moment. He looked surprised at my touch, and then reached up to cover my hand with his... He captured my hand, holding it in place as though he were savoring my touch. It gave me time to get used to it before I was bombarded with so many minds. Most people edit what they say so very carefully that at first it was quite shocking to hear what they were actually thinking about. "I learned to tune it out pretty quickly," he said, his face turned slightly into my hand. "I never thought that it would bother me to not know what someone was thinking." His tone was almost pained and reluctant, as though he did not want to admit to it. I threw my head back on the ground and laughed. Do I confound you that much? My mother has always said that I am an open book, far too easy to read. You know that already. He moved, shifting his weight to lean over me, smiling down into my face. Your eyes are so expressive. That is the only thing that consoles me. Still, you always surprise me. You never do or say what I expect. As he leaned over me, he reached out and he brushed his fingers through my hair as it trailed over the ground toward him. But you are getting to know me. Even a little? I asked, having ulterior motives in mind. Some. His smile grew a bit wider. Though I doubt that I will ever feel like I know everything about you. I hope that means that you're not as worried about me under normal circumstances. I could not forget what had almost happened with Mike. It's not that I worry about you, Bella, Edward said, looking down into my face seriously. It's the things you cannot plan for. I want to be able to protect you from the unexpected, like Mike. I want to be there to help you cope with those things. He paused, his expression serious, and I could tell he was trying to decide how to bring up something that was going to be more difficult. I braced myself for the worst, or at least everything I could think of that might be bad enough to make him prepare like that. We need to talk about the physical aspects of being a vampire too, Bella. There are some things you cannot help but notice. The speed, the strength, the change in your eyes. But there are other things that are not so obvious. He lifted my hand in so that he could look at my palm, his eyes searching for the lines of scars we both knew were no longer there. You have no more of the usual bodily fluids that you are used to. Nearly everything has been replaced by venom. He seemed more focused on my hand than on what he was saying. Venom? That one shocked me. I'm venomous? Like a snake? My reaction prompted a laugh as his eyes filled with amusement returned to my face. In a way, but our venom doesn't kill, Bella, at least not in the usual way. It is what starts the change. This is one of the reasons all of us were so shocked at your story. It would have been nearly impossible for your maker to know he left venom in your system and not know you were still alive when he left. His tone was incredulous. Our venom has two purposes. First, it paralyzes the victim with pain so that they are easily subdued before they die. Second, it gives us the means to change another into what we are. Perhaps he thought I was too far gone for the change? I offered, not sure what I was suggesting was even possible. Perhaps, Edward agreed reluctantly, but it seems far-fetched to me. Perhaps we will never know. You do not know who created you, and there's nothing left to identify him. That's not exactly true, I said softly, biting on my lower lip as I watched for his reaction. I know it was probably stupid of me, but I saved my t-shirt, the one I was wearing when I was attacked. If he carried me out of the city, it would still hold his scent, right? Edward looked at me in shock, sitting up suddenly. Bella, that's dangerous, having the smell of human blood around all the time. He seemed disappointed in me and impressed all at the same time. Oh, I made sure I wouldn't have to worry about that. My mother has one of those vacuum packing things, and one night when she and Phil were gone, I brought my shirt home. I'd hidden it in the desert and packed my shirt up in a bag with an airtight seal. I put it in a metal box and buried it a couple miles from Charlie's house when I got here. I smiled at him tentatively, offering that even if keeping it wasn't a smart thing for me to do, at least I was smart in how I did it. Edward gave me a long look and then shrugged. It didn't test your control at all, the scent of your own blood, he asked me, curious now. It did. I had to fight so much harder at first than I do now. Control comes easier with practice, and I was so worried about my mother. She would throw herself at me all the time, hugging me, like Alice did that first day. I sat up with him and brushed at the debris that had tried to adhere to my hair as we lay there. I don't approve of you keeping your shirt, Bella. In any case, there are other things I need to tell you, he continued. He wasn't pleased with my revelation, but he was determined to get through the rest of this information right now. For the most part, as vampires, we are absolutely unchanging. We are as we were when we were changed. Our personalities, our habits, the things that make us who we are. He stilled for a moment, pausing not just in word but in body as well. I wondered if this was something else that I wasn't going to like. There are few things that change us after the burning stops, from what Carlisle has observed. For us, emotions, loyalties, they do not flow like water as do humans. When we find those things that affect us, they alter us permanently. We are no longer the same as we were. His eyes met mine as he said this, and I didn't look away this time. Carlisle has seen this happen several times, he continued, though I could see this was difficult for him. There is only one regular aspect of our lives so powerful to change us in this manner, Bella. We do not love as humans do, Some vampires, they have relationships with each other, with humans, but the mating finding that part of you that was missing, the other half of your soul. It changes us as completely as we are capable of being changed. I knew what he meant. I'd felt it myself, though I had been a vampire such a short time. Meeting him had changed me. I was different. I was no longer just Bella. Now Edward was such a large part of me. What I wanted, where I would go, how I saw myself. So much had happened, though, in so short a span of time. I wasn't ready to declare myself. I wasn't sure I wanted to feel this way right now. I felt like my entire life was in flux, and it was getting harder, not easier, to cope. Not only that, I still had to be here for Charlie, to give him the illusion that I was still a teenage girl. I looked away, up, and noticed the sky growing darker. His glance followed mine, and it seemed that he knew that now was not the time to press this discussion. He drew me to my feet, gently, and smiled in apology. We were going to have to hurry if I was going to make it home before Charlie. Without another word, he turned and led me into the woods again, leading me toward home. Charlie was expecting me. He still hadn't relinquished my hand, even as we ran. My mind ran over what he'd said about mates again, and with the wind in my hair and the ground so solid under my feet, I admitted to myself that it was too late, for me at least. It was hard to believe that it could happen so soon after meeting him, but it was undeniable to me. Suddenly, I didn't want to deny it any longer, not to myself. I was again delighted, feeling it to my toes, that Edward could not read my mind. I really wasn't ready for him to know this. Too much in my life felt so out of control, as it was, but the truth of the matter could not be denied. I was completely, irrevocably, undeniably in love with Edward Cullen. I wondered at how fate had brought us both here at the same time to meet as we did. After I'd been attacked in Phoenix on one of my more depressed nights, I imagined fate as a wizened old woman who had plotted to ruin not only my life, but my parents' lives too. I didn't like the risk that they were being put through just by being near me. My fantasy of this figure of fate had started to change as I was growing to get to know Edward better. I knew through our talks that he worried about the state of his own soul. I could not believe that Edward didn't have a soul, that we were all damned just because of what we were. I believed wholly that the state of the soul was based heavily on intent, on the desire to be a good person. There was no one more good, in my mind, than Edward. I knew what he went through to be a good person, and to contribute back to humanity in his own way. I imagined that, if he had ever considered the hand of a figure like fate in his life, it would be the vengeful old woman I had imagined when I was still in Phoenix. After knowing him, I now like to think of fate more as a kind angel, one that could see the pain in our hearts and the fears in our minds. If I saw Edward as a person so deserving of happiness, I would imagine what fate would do to give him the gift of an end to his loneliness. She might have arranged for me to be turned into a vampire so that he could be in a relationship with me. She'd have placed my father in Forks so that it would be the only place that I could go to keep the secret. She'd have ensured that my change took place in a time frame that made me unbearably young as a vampire so that he could not ignore my presence and I would need the help that he could best provide. She would arrange the circumstances so that I would be strong enough to be a part of his life. I wanted to be this gift that fate had schemed to send Edward in the fanciful imaginings of my mind. I wanted to be the person that was able to end a century of disassociation, to show him how to be among the living again, and to experience the joy of caring so deeply about someone else. Edward had talked about mates. Did he feel the way I did? This soul-deep connection to each other. It made me start to hope for a fate-like figure, arranging things to her satisfaction, one that would make sure that Edward and I ended up together for the rest of our lives. It reminded me of one of my favorite lines in Browning's poetry, one specifically that I thought would never be one that I could apply to my own life. However, with Edward, the words meant so much to me. I wasn't ready to shout them to the world, as of yet, but I spoke them in the quiet of my soul. I yield the grave for thy sake, and exchange my near sweet view of heaven for earth with thee. Edward's scheme to get me out of my PE class came to nothing, so he made other arrangements that made him almost as happy. He charmed Miss Cope and both teachers so that he could trade his Spanish and PE classes. Now, he attended both of those classes when I did. This was wonderful, even if I had to have him witness some of my less graceful moments as I missed shots and deliberately fell on my face. Edward found it endlessly amusing to watch a vampire attempt to seem so human, but his presence kept me distracted from Mike's relentlessness. As Edward had warned me, Mike hadn't given up on me entirely and seemed to be hunting for ways that he could disrupt whatever relationship building was going on between Edward and me. He went out of his way to get me alone and bumped into me during class, no matter the sport we were doing. Edward put a stop to most of his antics pretty early, reacting fairly strongly when Mike tried to fall into me one day. I started to wonder if his plan was to annoy me until I gave in and went out with him. I was eternally grateful that Edward was there to make sure that Mike didn't volunteer himself into an early grave when we had to pair up in teams for badminton. After the first couple of days, Edward starting picking me up for school in his car, the rest of his family traveled back and forth in Rosie's bright red BMW. I loved the time we had alone together, back and forth from school, though it often made me nervous. He drove like a maniac, and I would pester him about being the chief's daughter and having to turn him in for breaking so many traffic laws. In the afternoon, we'd linger at my house for the most part. Both of us were very reluctant to share each other while we were getting to know one another. We'd do our homework, and then I'd work on Charlie's dinner. Edward always disappeared when we heard Charlie's car coming down the street. But he was always close by, either outside or up in my room waiting for me. Nights were my favorite part. We spent the first half of the night in the forest, hunting at first and then walking quietly together. The rest of the night was often in my room in case Charlie got up and checked in on me. We spent the entire time talking. We were getting to know each other, our likes, dislikes, habits, and histories. Edward had so much more to say than I did, naturally. I made sure of it since he had so much more time to cover. This time between us was easy and pleasant. It distracted me from the still unfamiliar feelings and thoughts that I had learned were normal and so much more enhanced in the usual newborn vampire. I was constantly coping with the rampant thirst, mood swings, and sudden aggression. All of these things were absolutely uncontrollable in the usual newborn, and I'd learned this was the main reason why Jasper always watched me so closely. I'd seen his scars, the mark of a dangerous and experienced fighter. Jasper was formidable. Any vampire who saw him would know it immediately. He'd survived every one of the fights in which he had gained each one of those scars, and each vampire who'd marked him thus had met their end. Edward explained Jasper's history to me, why he was so careful around me, and why I made him so nervous. Jasper didn't trust any newborn, and my apparent control mystified him. He'd interacted with countless newborns in his lifetime, and not a single one of them had ever exhibited the strength of mind that I did. It took some vampires up to 10 years before they could even remotely function around humans, without attacking them. Jasper still had issues with controlling his thirst, even now. It was a constant struggle to rein in his need to feast on humans. As difficult as it was for him to resist, it was nearly impossible for him to believe that I wasn't going to suddenly lose control and start slaughtering the town. I didn't laugh when Edward had revealed this to me. Sometimes I felt like I was going to go on a spree of pain and death all over Forks. Edward did make it easier in many ways. It was really riddle for me to think about bad things at all when we were together. But also, being around him made it so much easier for me to think about things other than my need to quench my thirst. More than that, after the time we spent together, he was now absolutely sure of my control even more than I was myself. I had never been a girl that needed the validation of someone else's opinion, but I could not avoid my new reality that Edward's belief in me made it easier for me to be stronger. A week after my arrival in Forks, Charlie invited his best friend, Billy Black, over for dinner. They'd been fishing together since my arrival, but I hadn't gone to the reservation with Charlie. Edward had warned me about the treaty, so I knew I had to stay out of Quilu territory. In taking me under their wing, I became a part of that, which meant I didn't cross the boundary line, which he showed me one night. That afternoon, Edward stayed with me until the time for Charlie to come home, and then he faded out into the back, presumably running home to spend some time with his own family. He didn't like leaving me alone for this, but felt that it probably wasn't a big deal. People didn't believe in the supernatural anymore, and he didn't think it would be any different than having anyone else in the neighborhood over. I still wasn't quite sure what my relationship with Edward was exactly. We'd never sat down and defined things exactly. But I wasn't ready to clue Charlie into the fact that there was now a man in my life. He was protective enough as it was, and I didn't think he was ready for me to have a boyfriend. Almost always, Edward spent the time when Charlie was awake out in the trees behind the house or hiding in my room. But Esme had been insisting that she missed him, so Edward had taken the opportunity tonight to go home and spent some quality time with his family. I'd taken some care with dinner since Billy's wife had died some years earlier, and he only had a son, just a couple years younger than me, at home. Charlie had to remind me of this small fact since most of my human life had faded into foggy memories, and this wasn't something I had retained. I figured a nice home-cooked meal wouldn't be horrible for them. I didn't know if Billy or his son was a good cook, so I thought it was better to be safe than sorry. I'd found a garlic rub for the fish that seemed like it would be yummy, even though human food didn't appeal to me anymore. I was in the kitchen frying up the fish when Billy and Jacob arrived. Charlie wasn't home yet, but I let them in anyway. Billy's face was instantly startled when he caught sight of me, which was really surprising. "Jacob," Billy said as he rolled into the house on his wheelchair and followed me into the kitchen. "Run out and check in the trunk of the car and get those pictures of your sisters." Charlie wanted to look at them. Jacob looked surprised at being sent out into the cold rain again, but only shrugged and went to do what he'd been asked. Billy looked like he wanted to talk, but I didn't want the fish to burn, so I went back to the kitchen and over to the stove. I turned the fillets carefully, trying to keep as much of it from sticking to the pan as I could. "Bella," Billy started, trying to get my attention. He sounded uncomfortable. "How long have you been like this?" "What do you mean?" I glanced back at him over my shoulder. "You are a cold one now, Bella," he said softly. "Like the Cullens. A vampire." I stilled, then looked up from the stove to meet Billy's eyes. He knew. I saw it in his face. Edward was wrong. People did still believe in the supernatural. "The Cullens! I didn't know you knew them." My mind was scrambling for options, explanations. I wasn't sure how to respond. I heard Jacob close the trunk of the car and start climbing the front steps. Billy heard him too, and realizing our time was short, he sighed softly. "We need to talk about this, but it isn't time for Jacob to know yet." There was a worried tone in his voice. "You are friends with the Cullens?" He seemed to want confirmation. I nodded. "Come with the leader of the Cullens to the boundary line straight west from Forks at midnight." "We'll meet you there," Billy said quickly, and then rolled over to a spot at the kitchen table where he set down the six-pack of beer that had been sitting in his lap. Jacob had made it to the kitchen door by then, shaking his head like a dog and flinging wet drops of rain all over his father. "There aren't any pictures of the girls in the trunk, Dad," Jacob said, smiling at the grimace on Billy's face as he got sprayed with rainwater. "You must have left them back at the house." "Ah, I must have," Billy agreed easily. "And I knew there never had been any pictures in the trunk. I'll have to bring them another time." I flipped the fish out of the pan and onto a serving dish, just as Charlie's patrol car rolled into the driveway, and I held back a sigh of relief. I was suddenly worried. I didn't want my father to know about all this supernatural stuff, and I didn't know that Billy wouldn't insist on telling him that his only child was now a vampire. This could easily turn very bad, very fast. Once again, my life here in Forks, which was so much better than I had ever expected it to be, felt threatened. Knowing about vampires would put Charlie at risk from the Volturi. Considering what Edward had told me, keeping Charlie in the dark was part of keeping the secret, the only vampire law. Charlie came stomping into the house, pleased to see his old friend, and the two immediately started talking about their planned fishing trip this weekend. They were going together to a spot they loved at Ozette Lake, just north of La Push, and they easily dominated the conversation with speculation about how their trip would go and what they might need to take with them. Dinner was nice, though I had to eat more than I usually did. Jacob watched me curiously throughout the night, but less closely than his father. After dinner, Billy and Charlie went into the living room to watch whatever game was on tonight, and Jacob stayed in the kitchen with me to help me clean up. "That was something new with fish," Jacob said, as he came over to help me with the dishes. "Huh. You live with a fisherman. You should know how the score goes. They bring home the fish. You are left having to find something to do with it because you have to make room in the freezer for the fish that they will bring home as soon as they can get away from work. Long enough." I reminded him with a wry smile as I buried my hands in the soapy water nearly to the elbow. He grabbed a dish towel and started to help by drying the dishes as I washed them. "Nah, I make Dad figure out what he's going to do with the fish he brings home. I'll cook if I have to, but I'm not good at it. We tend to take turns." Jacob's smile was infectious, and I returned it as I teased him about making his dad cook from his wheelchair. He took it all in good fun. It was almost like what I thought having a little brother would feel like. We laughed a lot as we washed the dishes and cleaned up the kitchen. By the time they were ready to leave, I was actually reluctant to see Jacob go. I'd enjoyed his visit more than I thought I would. When they left, I escaped upstairs, telling Charlie I was going to work on homework, but I was just looking for some time alone. I loved being with Edward, but alone time wasn't something that I had much of anymore, and I took advantage of it when I could. Just because I didn't need to sleep didn't mean that things couldn't sometimes get exhausting. When I got to my room, though, Edward was waiting for me. I took one look at the expression on his face and sighed, crawling onto my bed into my favorite spot. I flopped over to the side and covered my head with my pillow. "You heard that, huh?" I shouldn't have been surprised that he was aware of the little talk that Billy and I had earlier. He must have waited before he headed home if he'd even actually gone all the way home. He moved over to sit on the bed beside me and leaned over to pull the pillow off my head. I rolled onto my back so that I could look up at him, and his expression was absolutely serious as his eyes met mine. "I was listening to his thoughts as I left," he admitted, looking a bit sheepish. "I hadn't gone far when he noticed you were a vampire. I hadn't thought that the Quadalutes kept up the old stories and traditions, but I should have expected it. More than that, I should have recognized the name. His ancestor, Ephraim Black, is the one with whom we made the original treaty." Edward continued, cluing me in on the things he would have told me earlier if he'd known I might need it. "Billy's a member of the tribal council and the direct inheritor of the line of chiefs. If the Quadalutes had a real chief, it would be Billy Black." He brushed his fingers through my hair as he spoke. "So I'm going tonight, I guess." I smiled at the way he touched me almost absent-mindedly. It was as though he couldn't help himself. "It was nothing short of a summons from the tribal council," Edward agreed. "If we want the treaty to remain intact, the meeting has to happen. I don't like you going without me, though." Edward had become so protective, keeping me out of situations that might test my control or make me uncomfortable. No one had ever taken care of me before, and I liked not always having to be the reasonable adult in every situation. It made me feel cared for. "It was pretty clear me and the leader, which is Carlisle," I explained, reiterating what he already knew. "Well, you aren't going without me close. My brothers and I will stay a mile or so away, but close enough to help if it's needed." His eyes focused on me again, and he stopped brushing back my hair, as though he just realized that he was doing it. "You must have been a menace as a human, Bella," he complained gently. "Look at all the trouble you get into when you're warm and breakable." I laughed at that because I knew he didn't want me warm and breakable in any way. Humans were too dangerous to be around unless you had a reason stronger than your thirst. I'd learned that with my parents. But he was right that I'd been even more of a magnet for disaster as a human. He was so protective now, and I wondered for a brief second how much worse he would be if he had known me as a human. "Well, Edward, I'm not going to apologize for not being human any longer," I informed him tartly. "I couldn't have predicted this one. I wonder why Alice didn't," he said, as he pulled his phone out of the pocket of his jeans and looked at it quietly. He looked surprised to find that there wasn't an unread text on his phone. "You're right, this isn't the sort of thing that she would miss. Doesn't she usually see the big things?" I confirmed his worry as he hit the speed dial that called Alice's phone. "I see that Bella and Carlisle are going to the Quaalude boundary line tonight, Edward, but I can't see why," Alice said as she answered her phone, skipping the greeting. I could hear everything as clearly as if Alice had been standing right beside us. "Yay for vampire hearing. Billy Black was here at Bella's house tonight and had dinner with Charlie," he explained, though they'd talked about it earlier. "Billy Black? You'd told me he was going to be by, but I didn't actually see him there at her house." Alice wondered quietly, sounding upset that she didn't already know. "They've kept the old stories alive, Alice," Edward explained. "He wants to talk about the treaty. Billy knows that Bella is a vampire." "Oh," Alice's tone revealed her sudden understanding. "Why didn't I see this?" There was a pause. "I can't see the meeting either," Edward. Alice's voice turned suddenly hard, and she sounded upset again. "They want to meet with just Bella and Carlisle, but I thought Emmett, Jasper, and I could wait about a mile away in case something goes wrong." Edward explained. Billy's thoughts weren't outright antagonistic. He was just worried why Bella was changed and wanted to know if we'd done it. "He's worried we broke the treaty." That didn't seem to mollify Alice, and she made a rude sound of frustration. "I'm coming with you, Edward. I'll let Carlisle know, and we'll meet you at the baseball clearing at 11 hour. I don't like not being able to see what is going to happen." Alice hung up suddenly, and Edward's fingers curled around his phone, closing it. "You heard all that?" He knew I had, but I nodded anyway. We both paused when we heard Charlie moving around downstairs in his evening ritual before heading up to check on me. I jumped off my bed, spread out my homework, and looked studious as Edward slipped into the closet. By the time Charlie opened my door with a quick knock, everything looked like my father expected, and I was able to look up at him innocently as he told me good night and headed off to bed. Edward slid out of the closet, and came up behind the chair. I was sitting in, it was only 10 hours in, and I didn't know how I was going to wait patiently until it was time to leave. Charlie had to go to sleep before I was going anywhere. I turned back to my desk and started on what little homework I had left, as Edward looked down to see what I was working on. I often completed my assignments early, but I occasionally wanted the distraction of something to do while I waited for Charlie to conk out. Charlie usually passed out pretty quickly. But that didn't mean that I wasn't going to go nuts waiting for it tonight. After a moment, Edward started to gather my hair, running his fingers through the strands and pulling it away from my face. I looked back at him in surprise, and he shrugged, shooting me that uneven smile that I loved. "I need something to occupy me too," he explained, as though it should be obvious to me. "Messing with my hair cannot be all that absorbing." The look of surprised disbelief on his face made me laugh, as I'm sure it was meant to. He just shrugged again in answer, as though he didn't expect me to understand. His touch distracted me so much that it was impossible for me to even work on my homework. I could only concentrate on the feel of his long pianist's fingers sliding through the strands of my hair. After a few moments of me sitting there doing nothing but enjoy his touch, he tugged on my hair gently. "What about your assignment, Bella?" His voice was low and amused. "Like that's possible when you're touching me." I still didn't like admitting these embarrassing things, but he'd gotten so persistent about making me answer his questions, and I knew he'd get it out of me eventually. "It's just your hair, Bella," he said, as though he didn't know the effect his touch had on me. I leaned back to look up at him, resting my head on the back of my chair, and I smiled into his face. "No, I like it, Edward. Right now, it's relaxing me. It's soothing." Even his touch on my hair sent an electric charge through me that I was sure would never fade in intensity, but it still brought a peace I rarely felt otherwise. He dropped my hair to rest his hands on my shoulders, and he smiled down into my face. After a second, he smiled unhappily. "I really don't like you going without me tonight," he said softly, and then stepped back as I rose from my chair and turned to wrap my arms around him. "It'll be all right, Edward. No one broke the treaty, and Billy will understand that. He's been Charlie's friend for a long time," I tried to reassure him. Unfortunately, I wasn't so sure myself. Then again, what could a small group of humans do to a large group of vampires in retaliation for breaking the treaty, even if that were the case? I respected Billy, but he was one middle-aged man in a wheelchair. The tribal elders may not all be disabled, but I was pretty sure they were all older men. Older human men. Charlie distracted me from my thoughts with a snort. He was snoring, and I laughed at the sound, dropping my head onto Edward's shoulder. I loved how predictable my father was. The minute we heard loud snoring from Charlie's room, it was safe to get going. Edward drew back and walked over to the window, pulling it open and gesturing me out. "Come on," he directed me with a smile. "Even if it isn't time to meet the others, let's get out of the house." I grinned at him as I walked over and hopped out the window, turning to watch as he closed it. We shimmied down the tree at the same time and headed out into the forest behind the house hand in hand.